The human spirit is something that can only be explained or understood by a few. An unstoppable force so powerful that it's able to persevere when nothing else can. In the early 1940s, the world was consumed by war. And yet, against all odds, sports still found a way to unite complete strangers towards one common goal: competition. This is what you don't know about the Lost Olympics. Welcome to What You Don't Know About Sports, where we delve into the forgotten stories, teams, and athletes of sports history and question widely held takes on today's sports. I'm Blake, and this is Matt.
Howdy.
And today we're going to tell you a story about perseverance and strength in the midst of a world war, and that's the Olympic Games of 1940 and 1944. Now, Matt, when I say the word Olympics, it means a lot to me, but what comes to your mind? What do you think of when I say that word?
Two things come to mind immediately. The first is competition, because it is just weeks of turn on the TV and there's something happening with people at the pinnacle of whatever it is they're doing. And the second thing is quite possibly the best anthem or theme in anything, not just sports. But that Olympic theme by John Williams that NBC uses always comes to my mind as soon as somebody says the word, because it's a banger. It is the best one, I think. It is great. I love it.
It is quite an anthem. I would have to agree with you there. It's one of the better ones, if not the best one. But I think you said it right when you said competition, because it's just the greatest at any sport competing against each other. And that's beautiful. Like, you don't have to speak their language. You don't have to understand what they're saying, but they all are competing in the same sport, and it's beautiful. It's an amazing thing to watch.
And it doesn't matter what sport, right? Like, you can just turn it on and it's two dudes playing ping pong, table tennis. And you would never, ever, ever on a normal Saturday spend 30 minutes or an hour watching people play table tennis. But because it's the Olympics, you can be entertained by it. It's table tennis and wrestling. It's curling in the Winter Olympics.
Curling.
It's stuff that would not get you pumped up any other time, but it's the Olympics, so you have to be excited for it. I think my favorite moment, the moment I think of is like Michael Johnson, the runner from the 90s, wearing his gold shoes in Atlanta. That's the moment I think for me whenever somebody says the Olympics. But yeah, just competition in general.
I was going to say that is the moment on the track with him tying those gold spikes.
Yeah.
And him about to run the 100-meter. I don't know. It just seemed like I was 5 when that happened. Yeah. And I remember where I was when we watched it. It was in the Summer Olympics, and we were on vacation at the beach. And I remember sitting in the hotel room and my mom and dad telling me to come watch this because of what was about to happen. Mm-hmm. And him tying those gold cleats, it just seemed like the world stopped for a minute, or 10 seconds if he's running the 100-meter. But it just stopped. Everything stopped. And it was just a beautiful time because it's just worldwide competition, the best people doing what they do on the biggest stage. It's an amazing thing. So we're going to talk to you today about what is known as the Lost Olympics. And those are the Summer Olympic Games specifically of 1940 and 1944. But we have to rewind a little bit to tell you how we got to the Summer Olympics of 1940 and 1944. So all the way back in 1933, okay, the League of Nations essentially condemns Japan because of their aggressive militarism, and they essentially alienated Japan from world politics at this time. And it was in 1933 that Japanese delegates within the League of Nations staged a walkout. At the same time, though, Japan still won the bid for the 1940 Summer Olympics. And IOC granted them this, what is being looked at in hindsight as a way to mitigate the tensions internationally, because everybody was on their proverbial edge with each other, and this was kind of a way to try and mend the fences, if you will. So in 1936, the IOC actually granted Tokyo the Summer Olympics, but the Japanese government didn't really want the Summer Olympics. The IOC just kind of gave it to them, supposedly. They thought that Japan, that is, thought that planning and preparing for the Olympics in 1940 would take away from their obligations on the war front. And again, they were at odds with multiple countries at this point. So they got it, and they didn't want it. I don't know how that happened, but I thought that was an interesting thing.
It is an interesting thing, and it just, the fact that the 1936 Olympics were in Germany, and then the 1940 Olympics, they were like, Japan, here you go. This would be great. They're not 0 for 2 on those situations. But yeah, Japan was in a weird spot because they had more or less missed out and were interfered with when Europe was going about and being imperialistic and taking over whatever they wanted. And then when they were finally able to participate, that's when Europe was like, no, hey, this is bad. We shouldn't do this anymore. And so Japan's like trying to expand because they thought that's what they were supposed to do. And everybody else is like, whoa, no, we don't do that anymore. And so I say that in air quotes. And so, that was part of their issue with the world in a nutshell. Obviously, way more to it, but the synopsis of what was going on. That's crazy though, that they were just like, yeah, this is going to make things better. And we still do this, right? We still do this where it's like, this place, if we put this thing here, it's going to make everything better. And more often than not, it doesn't always work.
It really just highlights the imperfections of the situation, if we're being honest. I can't think of one off the top of my head where like a major athletic competition was given to a particular country or a particular region, and it was like the magic that cured all the problems in the world.
And I think we learned our lesson, at least with the Olympics. The World Cup is slightly different, but we learned our lesson in 2004 with the Athens Olympics, where they spent so much money in building up all the places that it was going to take, things were going to take place. And then as soon as the Olympics were over, they've just got all these like white elephants that don't have any purpose. They just have all these structures that don't do anything. And that's not the wealthiest country in the world for sure. And so we just kind of realized that maybe this isn't the best way to handle things. Like you said, it highlights the imperfections. It highlights, as all the good and all the bad that goes on in a place. So you got to be careful where you put them. Really,
yes, very true. Speaking of monetary issues, Japanese organizers of the 1940 Summer Olympics were actually told to build the facilities for the Olympics out of wood because the military needed all the metal they could get their hands on for wartime. I thought that was an interesting fact that was apparently like an actual delegation to the organizers to say only use wood because we need everything else.
Just use all the wood. I hope there's not a spark or it'll be lit for real.
Yeah, if it lit, it's lit. So on to 1937. To the Second Sino-Japanese War. Japan invaded China, and the Japanese government decided to drop the Summer Games, officially forfeiting in July of 1938. Now, I don't know why it took them so long after they declared war on a neighboring country, but it was said that many countries in the West, such as United States, United Kingdom, pretty much all of Scandinavia. They were going to boycott the games anyway, just because of Japan's actions and everything that was going on at the time. So after Japan forfeited the games in 1938, the IOC granted the 1940 Summer Olympics to Helsinki, Finland, who were the runners-up in the bidding. Well, June 1939, right before the 1940 Olympics were supposed to happen, the IOC visited London in hopes of granting them the 1944 Summer Olympic Games. After a visit, the games were given to London, and London in this bidding process beat out Belgrade, Lausanne in Switzerland, and Detroit. Some of you today might be wondering, Detroit? Yes, Michigan was in the running to host the Summer Olympics in 1944, just as LA did in 1932. But it was the booming economy with the cars and the manufacturing and the assembly lines and stuff like that drew a lot of attention. So yes, Detroit, Michigan was on that list.
That's one of those places that highlights how much can change generation to generation. So there was a couple of generations where Detroit was a major metropolis, and it still is, but it's not what it used to be for sure. But even in the state it's in now, not the super weirdest place that would have hosted an Olympics. Remember in the 80s, Lake Placid, New York is going to be the host of the Winter Olympics. Not New York City or Albany or Syracuse or anywhere. Lake Placid, New York. It's going to be the host of the Winter Olympics. It's been in some stranger places. But yeah, Detroit was a booming metropolis in the 40s.
That's true. They were cranking cars, and apparently that was attractive to the rest of the world. So 3 months after London was given the games in June 1939, in September, Hitler invaded Poland, Great Britain and France declared war on Germany, and London forfeited the 1944 Summer Olympic Games just 3 months after they were granted to them. I see this is happening before the 1940 Olympics even happened, but they had the foresight to know what was coming, and they didn't have the resources and the ability to plan such an event, of course. So 3 months after they were given to them, they basically declared war on Germany, and they had to forfeit the games. In April 1940, Helsinki had to forfeit the 1940 Summer Olympic Games after the Soviet Union invaded Finland. And then after that, instead of trying to grant it to another person on such short notice, the 1940 Games were ultimately canceled upon the start of World War II. And then shortly after the 1940 Games were canceled, the IOC also canceled the 1944 Summer Olympics upon seeing everything that was happening and the war breaking out.
And that's a situation where I'm sure they were far enough out that if it was something that was going to blow over, they could reschedule. But everyone has experience. This is famously all occurring a little more than a decade after the war to end all wars that didn't. And so they know that it's going to take a long time. They know that the last time they fought it was a 4-year ordeal. So everybody's kind of putting the pieces together and understanding that this is going to be a larger conflict, that specifically all of the countries of Europe are not going to be able to do anything with. And at that point in history, if you don't have the countries of Europe participating, you don't have a lot of strong contenders, just the way international sport was at the point.
Fascinating, right? Well, so at this point, both the 1940 Summer and the 1944 Summer Games were canceled. Now, with war raging through Europe and Asia, the games were relocated multiple times and eventually canceled. You may be thinking, competition-wise, at this stage, all was lost. But you'd be wrong. The human spirit would not allow it. Enter Theodore Neuadomsky and Janusz Kusokinski. Okay? If you've never heard of them, it's okay. I had never heard of them either. But we're going to tell you their stories, okay? So, starting with Neuadomsky. He was born in Poland. He was actually working at a gas plant in 1939 when the war broke out. He mobilized with the Polish military without saying goodbye to his mother and was appointed squad commander at an outpost about 500 meters from the German border. This was right before Germany invaded. After Germany invaded, while retreating, he was wounded and captured. He attempted to escape 2 different camps after being captured, but was unsuccessful, and subsequently landed in Stalag 13 in Langwasser, which is a district of Nuremberg. Now, you're probably wondering by now, this isn't a war history lesson. It's not. I'm getting to it. Be patient, people. So, at Stalag 13, due to the internationality of the prisoners at this particular camp, Neurodomsky, along with other prisoners, decided to create an athletic competition in the spirit of the canceled 1940 Summer Olympic Games. Now, at this particular camp, and at most camps, Nazi concentration camps, exercise and sport was not allowed. They didn't want prisoners to be physically in shape. So they did this in secret, and they called this competition the International Prisoner of War Olympic Games. The athletics and the sport were banned, like I said, but they convinced one German soldier working at the camp. His name was Roger Virion. He assisted the prisoners with the games by obtaining items that the prisoners couldn't obtain for them to be able to compete in different competitions and stuff. Isn't this this is crazy already, right?
Yeah, this is already interesting. But there's always that one person. I feel like in these kinds of stories, granted, they usually happen. You usually see these kind of stories in movies, so there always is the one person because that's what's written to be. But it does always seem there's the one person out there who has more humanity to them than the job requires, and so this soldier would be that for this story, where he's going to provide things and he's going to look the other way and he's going to kind of let it happen because he knows the deal, and he's fighting a war too. He knows how bad it really is, and so yeah, shout out to my man there. Also, when you're starting to tell this story about doing things in secret, I know it's more serious than this, but I started picking up some like real strong Hogan's Heroes vibes. Where like just a bunch of people doing stuff under the nose of the unwitting Germans as they just go about their business.
Yeah, kind of like that. Almost. So Neurodomsky and the other prisoners actually went so far as to create an Olympic flag and numerous country flags out of an old T-shirt and crayons. They drew on an old T-shirt one of the prisoners had, and drew the interlocking Olympics rings, and there were multiple different nationalities in this camp, and they each drew their own country flag so that they could be represented at this Olympic Games. Now, the competitions included multiple disciplines, and we're going to go through those. The first one was volleyball, and from what I could find, they didn't compete necessarily by country in this. That was more of just a fun thing to do. But the next one was cycling, and they actually took an old bicycle with the help of the German soldier. He took an old bicycle, attached it to 2 stools, and he somehow put a counter on the old bicycle to respond to pedal movements, so that they knew how far or how fast they were moving. It's pretty interesting for the times, I think.
There's some science going on here.
Yeah, that's pretty intense, right? The next one was the shot put. They found a 6-kilogram cobblestone. That's what they competed in the shot put with. They actually competed in archery. Somehow they got their hands on enough equipment to compete in archery, and I think they had to do most of these indoors as to not be seen. But I don't know. Somehow they ended up with equipment to compete in archery, which is pretty sick. They did compete in a long jump, where apparently they jumped over a small ditch with water in it, and somehow they made that into a competition. The most interesting one to me, though, the very last competition that was noted when I was researching this was called the Camp Frog. And I couldn't figure out what this was until I finally found another source that explained it. And that source actually was one of the memoirs that Neurodomsky wrote after all of this was over. He made it out, and he wrote multiple memoirs. And in one of those memoirs, he detailed these games. That's pretty much the only reason that we know that they existed, because he smuggled some of the artifacts out, and he lived to tell the story. So the Camp Frog involved a 50-meter long race, which included jumping into a squat. So imagine like a jump squat straight up and down, but like leaping forward. The Camp Frog was apparently used by Nazi guards as a punishment for the prisoners. They would make them do it for like hours at a time as punishment. Well, because Neurodomsky was sort of a rebel, he had already tried to escape twice, and he was Polish. Apparently, he was punished a lot for these things between his heritage and his escape attempts, and he won this competition because of how many times he had to do that move. So he beat out the rest of the prisoners in that competition, and they actually in secret again made diploma type pieces of paper for winning and crafted medals out of each of these.
But it just highlights the ingenuity of people. Number one, when pressed into a situation, they will find a way. Hopefully, if in this situation, not all situations, but in this one, they were able to. And again, the humanity of it to make it work, and to use your punishment. Right, you're trying to hide it, and you're trying to do this in secret. So use what you've been given. They make you do this as a punishment. So go outside and do it. And it looks like you're being punished, but really in your mind, you're competing with the people beside you, making the best of an absolutely horrendous situation in this case. Yeah.
It's amazing. So after the games were over, they didn't last long, of course, because there were only a few competitions, but it was a small respite, I think, for the prisoners to kind of escape. Speaking of escaping, Neurodomsky would eventually escape a third time, and this one was successful. And like I said earlier, he smuggled artifacts such as the Olympic flag that they made, some notes that he wrote while he was there, and all of that stuff. And they are now in Poland's Museum of Sports and Tourism. So they are still there. This is basically the only reason that we know that these games existed. They were held in secret. And one of the memoirs he wrote detailed the games. So that's how we know. After escaping the third time, he made it all the way to Warsaw. He lived under his deceased brother's name, and he ended up working at a cleaning plant as a garbage bin cleaner. And he was able to drive vehicles into the Polish ghettos, and he transported weapons and ammunition to the civilians still living in there. But unfortunately, eventually he was turned in by a coworker and reported to the Gestapo. Eventually, he escaped captivity yet again, made it back to Warsaw, where his mother and his wife were living, and then he seemed to stay safe for the rest of his life. And then that's when he started writing memoirs, and those, I think, at the end of his life, he donated to the museum as well. So just an amazing story of just humans persevering. That's what I got out of this, was just, you make the best of a terrible, terrible situation. And that's exactly what he did, and he lived to tell the story.
Along with 2 failed escape attempts and 1 completed escape attempt. And on the third, the one that first succeeded, he becomes essentially a certified war hero to an extent, smuggling weapons into Polish ghettos to help them fight back. That is somebody that should be more prominently known in just in history, period, that he's able to do all this stuff. Granted, it's one prison camp, it's one person, but it does show the difference one person can make when given the right opportunity. I don't want to make it sound like being in a prison camp is an opportunity, right? We're not trying to do that, but when put in a specific situation, sometimes people can do ridiculous things. Certainly one of those for that version of it.
I want to say also that I read from a different source that him driving the vehicles in and out of the neighborhoods and the ghettos and stuff allowed him to actually pick up Polish people and get them out before they were captured. And he saved upwards of like 200 people over, I think it was a year or 2 years or something that he did this before he was caught again. And so he saved a couple hundred people minimum just by going back in. Like he could have left. Like I'm sure plenty of people did that. Plenty of people, like once they left for the first time or once they were successfully able to leave, they left and like never looked back. And he went back in, basically undercover almost, and did all these things that who knows how many lives he actually saved or like, I mean, he made a huge impact just on that area alone. But really, really an amazing story. I'm with you. I think he needs to be more known about. And they actually made a movie that he was one of the characters in, called in English, it's called Olympics 40. I'm assuming that it was a Polish director, and that's the language that it was directed in. So the spelling on Olympics is a little bit different, but they did make a movie about it, and it was directed and made in 1980, I think. But basically outlining this story. So
nice.
Really, really interesting stuff.
So I have quickly put together a trivia question, but I got one for you.
You a question for me?
Yeah. Even though it's your episode, I still got one for you. Still got one for you.
Let's do it.
I will give you, because normally I give you like, you know what? I'll give you 5 questions or guesses. Since it's technically a trivia question, and it's not like guessing a person.
5 guesses. Okay.
5 guesses. So, since World War II, the United States has hosted the most Olympic Games with 5. There are 2 countries tied in second with 4 hosting each. That's counting upcoming games as well. Can you name either of the 2?
Since World War II.
Since World War II.
Okay. So if we're doing the questions, let me think. So there's 2 options. So I got to figure out how to ask.
How to narrow it down, yeah.
Yeah.
That's going to be the hard part here.
This is tricky.
Yeah, I've got your ball here.
All right, let me think. Are your countries in Europe?
One of the countries is in Europe.
One is in Europe.
Yes.
Is the I don't think it would be South America. I'm stuck on Europe and Asia. So is the other country in Asia?
The other country is in Asia.
Okay.
That's 2 of your questions.
So 1 European, 1 Asian. I feel like I should have gotten 5 questions for each answer.
I mean, we normally give you 10. So if you want 10.
That's fair. All right.
You want to make it easy on yourself.
I see, but how do I narrow it down?
We'll play on easy mode here.
So for the European country. Yeah, I need the easy mode. For the European country.
All right.
How many of the games were summer and how many were winter? Do you know?
3 were winter, including 1 upcoming games. And 1 was in the summer.
1 upcoming games in Europe. 1 upcoming game in Europe. So I don't know my future Olympics like that.
Yeah. I don't have them memorized.
I feel like it wouldn't be It wouldn't be England, would it? Because London was one of the cities.
It would not be England.
It's not England.
All
right, how else do I narrow it down?
To this date, England, the United Kingdom as a whole, has hosted just the one in our lifetimes, the 2012 Summer Olympics.
Okay. I was hoping that they had hosted additional ones.
Well, the 48 one that we are going to, it's in our stories, the 48 in 2012.
So they have 2. I'm looking for a country with 4.
With 4.
Oh geez.
So you can use other sports questions, though, because it's in Europe. So you could use other sports to figure out.
Okay, hold on. Has this country ever won a World Cup? Because I feel like that might help me narrow it down.
This country has won a World Cup.
A World Cup.
This country has won 4 World Cups.
Oh, Jesus Christ. I don't know how many questions I'm at just for this one, but...
you are on 4, so you're at 6 total, I believe.
So I got one more European country question, and then I gotta go. When did they win the World Cup?
They've won the World Cup in 1934, 1938, 1982, and 2006.
2006 World Cup winners would be Italy?
Italy has hosted the World Cup. Not the World Cup. I'm sure they've done that too. Italy has hosted the Olympics 4 times since World War II. In 1956 in Cortino d'Ampezzo. Didn't know that was a thing, but there you go. 1960 in Rome. And then again in Turin in 2006. And they will be hosting the 2026 Olympics as well, the Winter Olympics.
Oh, interesting.
So there you go. Now you got to figure out the Asian country.
All right, so I got 3 questions left in Asia.
I think you have one. I think actually you've only asked one.
Oh, I've only asked one. I was like, I got one left. No way.
One for the Asian country. This one will be relatively easy for you, though.
Relatively easy?
Yeah.
Can I just guess Japan?
Yeah.
It is?
It's really Japan. It's really Japan. Japan had to wait a while after World War II, but 1964 in Tokyo, and then 1972 in Sapporo, so relatively quick back-to-back. Then 1998 in Nagano for the Winter Olympics, and then they obviously, as people are first downloading this episode, will be listening to it during the Tokyo Olympics.
The second individual I want to talk to you about, Janusz Kusokinski, also Polish-born. He was an athlete from the get-go. He began his track career early on in his adolescence, and he won multiple competitions, championships, and medals. He won a 5,000 meter and a cross-country match in the Polish National Championships. He actually missed the very next track season because he was called to duty by the Polish army, so he went and served in the military. Came back out, won various Polish championship titles in track for 1930, 1931, 1932. He ended up going to Los Angeles, competing in the Summer Olympic Games in 1932, won a gold medal for Poland there. He finished second in the first European Championships in the 5,000 meter race, and then retired from competing. A few years later, he came back and won the 10,000 meter at the Polish National Championships in 1939. So this guy just couldn't stop winning. Like he was probably maybe the greatest Polish tracks, at least of that era. And then in 1939, after that last championship, he volunteered for the Polish army again when Poland was invaded by Germany, similar time to when Niewiadomski ended up joining the army as well. He was wounded. Kusokinski was wounded twice. He was arrested by the Gestapo in March of 1940, and he was imprisoned. And he was actually, unfortunately, executed 3 months later. So that sort of his life and his story. Flashback a little bit to September of 1939, right around the time when Germany invaded. About 500 Polish officers were captured and forced into labor. Those captured Polish military officers were made to build a prisoner of war camp that they would spend the next few years living in. This camp was eventually named Wodenberg Aflag. This place eventually grew with a population of about 7,000 people, and it was a small town at this point. It had its own postal service inside of the camp. That's how big this place was. But unlike other Nazi concentration camps, prisoners at this camp could exercise and play sports. I think this was one of the few that they allowed that at.
I wonder if that's got to do with. So it was officers that were there first. So I wonder if it's got to do with like there were officers present. It was kind of higher ranking military people, and so things were more lax. Sometimes you see that, sometimes you don't. In historic war situations, so I don't know. This would have been a time where officers were like gentlemen and higher class people in general. So I don't know.
I didn't find a reason as to why this camp in particular they were allowed to exercise and play sports and stuff, but it's interesting that it did, because the combination of them being allowed to exercise and play sports with the particular prisoners that were there makes for another great story. Just you wait. So the prisoners convinced the guards, the Nazi guards, their captors, to allow them to stage their own Olympics within the camp. A multinational sporting competition similar to the one we just talked about, except this one wasn't kept a secret. They didn't have to keep it a secret. They convinced the guards to let them do it. Okay? There were a few things that they couldn't do, though. Fencing, archery, javelin, pole vault, to name a few, for obvious security reasons. But that was the stipulation.
We'll let y'all run around all you want to, but we ain't giving you nothing pointy at all. Not one bit, nothing.
Yeah, that was the rule. And so on July 23rd, 1944, the games began with a full opening ceremony. They made an Olympic flag, this time out of a white bed sheet and colorful scarves with the interlocking Olympic rings. And apparently, I can imagine it when I read it. It was probably a beautiful moment when the prisoners and the guards supposedly both saluted the Olympic flag as it was raised up a pole during the opening ceremony. I'm just imagining that happening, and that was probably a really cool moment. So these games actually lasted 21 days, and they competed in more stereotypical Olympic games like soccer, basketball, track and field, volleyball, handball, and other competitions. There were actually 369 competitors, but there were more actual competitions than competitors. So some of the competitors had to compete in multiple sports, not had to, but chose to compete in multiple sports. And similar to if you listen to the Marathon from Hades episode from the 1904 Summer Olympics, they also used to hold cultural events like painting, sculpting, music, kind of like a fair type atmosphere at these types of things. And they did something similar where they held painting events and other art and music type things. So they tried to make it as realistic as possible. You gotta give it to them, and they, again, making the best type of situation out of nothing, really.
Yeah, and this one is obviously a better production, but it just shows you that every situation's not the same, because the camp is different than the camp that Neuendomsky was putting his Olympics on in, and the atmosphere was different and the style was different, but they still made it happen, and there was still some sense of cooperation, even though there was a war going on, even though there were bigger atrocities being committed. There still is that sense of good competition and humanity and sportsmanship that the Olympics brings, that Olympic spirit that everybody wants to talk about, seems to be in both of these situations. But they're not the same situation. Stuff doesn't work out the same way necessarily.
It's fascinating. But unfortunately, the break from the camp life, the concentration camps, it was short-lived. It only lasted 3 weeks. After the competitions were over, and as troops closed in on the camps, the guards forced the prisoners out of the camp, and they had to march hundreds of miles through terrible, brutal winters, and they had to go all this way to resettle at another camp so that the camp wouldn't be broken up. And in early 1945, when American soldiers finally freed the prisoners, only about 300 of them had survived out of the approximately 7,000 who were there in the very beginning. Similar to the Novodomsky story, the flag from the 1944 POW Olympic Games also survived. It is also in Poland's Museum of Sports and Tourism. So I thought that was interesting. Again, the 44 games were a little more open. It was more of a production because it was open, and the prisoners apparently printed pamphlets with the competitions and stuff in them. There were so-called reporters who would write articles and stuff about the day's happenings and the events and the winners and stuff. So the second one, the 44 games, were a little more official, if that's the right word to use. But it was a little more realistic. It was a little more similar to what an actual Olympic Games would have been. But two amazing stories, and the prisoners at the 44 games, the prisoners who put on the 44 games, were inspired by Kusakinski, who was Polish, and the Polish officers who were forced to build the camp and such. They were inspired after they heard about his death to still put on a competition in his vein, and of course for their own sake and sanity.
Yeah, and obviously, though, from the end of the story, didn't work out for them as well as it did for Novodomsky. As part of the whole, it's one of the unfortunate parts of World War II, along to go with one of the cool parts of World War II, is them having the Olympics. But the way the Germans lost is not the way you would want any country to lose a war. The way they treated people as they were losing was some of the worst moments of that time period. So obviously, some of those guys got caught up in that, but it does highlight, but both of those stories highlight some of the things that happen in wars. The Olympics, the whole deal in World War I on the first Christmas, only the first one, but the first Christmas where they played, German and British soldiers playing football together in between the trenches because it's Christmas Day and we should be celebrating Christmas and we shouldn't be killing each other on Christmas Day. Let's just have a moment. Those things happen from time to time, not all the time, but sometimes we remember that we're people as we're trying to not act as people. That comes through, and I'm glad it did. I'm glad that technically there was Olympics in 1940 and 1944, even though the world couldn't get their stuff together. These guys took it upon themselves to make it happen, and that's cool. I love that.
Yeah, the humanity of these two stories in particular, it's somewhat relatable to. I mean, you could relate it to lots of different goings on in the world, either today or previously, where some humans just understand where they are and their place, and they just get it. They understand that just because I'm different, I look different from you, I talk different from you, I can't understand you, you don't look like me, but we're still human. Some people just get it, and some people don't, right? That can be applied to today's world too. And so just understanding, this is a great story, two stories of people just understanding, having humanity for each other, just for being in the situations that they were in. It's I can't believe I'd never heard of these stories before. Kind of came across them by accident, but I had. It's weird that these aren't talked about more.
It's incredible with the way the Olympics is presented with human interest stories constantly. There's bound to have been a Polish athlete who was prominent, or a Polish team or athlete that pulled some upset, or just some time that needed to be filled on a broadcast to tell these stories. At some point, you would think that it would be one of those things they just come back to over and over again while they're trying to fill 200 hours of time. But to my knowledge, I've never heard it either, which is something that I don't know. I don't get it either. I don't get it because it's interesting. I think people would pay attention to that story whenever they inserted it. So I don't know.
I don't know if it's a situation where they're just trying to not make people look bad on this sort of front, like because Olympics are supposed to be everyone coming together, no hate whatsoever. So they're like, if they were to introduce these stories on like live broadcast, everybody would like immediately just hate Germany,
But then we do the Berlin, no, the Munich games. We do that situation, to death. With the hostage situation. So
I don't get it. I don't understand. I'm glad we came across this though, because it's definitely inspiring. And if you ever feel it's easy today to look at someone who looks different from you and talks different from you, and it's easy to not want to speak, not want to pave that path, not want to cross that bridge, to mend the fences and stuff. We're all humans, man. Just let it happen. It's a beautiful thing. Ultimately, though, back to the Olympics. London did eventually get to host the 1948 Summer Olympic Games, which was the next Summer Olympics after the war ended. Helsinki got their chance. They hosted the following Summer Olympics in 1952, and eventually Tokyo also hosted a Summer Olympic Games in 1964. So all three of the countries who had to forfeit their bids, well, for one reason or another, they all had to forfeit their bids. They all got their chance. London, Helsinki, and Tokyo within the next 20 years. So at least they got the chance. I'm sure none of Tokyo stuff was still there 20 years later. They had to rebuild it all or whatever, but they did get a chance. And this was probably a calmer time in what was going on in Japan. So congrats to everybody who got to finally host after years and years of turmoil.
Everybody got to have their chance. So that's good.
Any we talked about how these games and these events should be covered more, but any more thoughts on the time, the games, anything you got left?
I mean, just I don't know, just the idea that people could make this work in a spot where you wouldn't think it would, especially the first story with Lewandowski, where they're not even supposed to be exercising and they figure out a way to have the Olympic Games. That just, I don't know, something special about that human spirit and the Olympic spirit. I know it's like a commercial, manufactured thing now, but I think there's something to it. I think there's something about the Olympics that brings out the bad in some people, but I think it brings out the good in a lot of people. I think the Olympic spirit is a thing. It's one of those things where if you say it enough, it's true. And I think it is one of our culture's special events, and we should enjoy it every chance we get, because we just saw a case where we went a while without Olympics during World War II, and we are living through a time where we skipped a year and very possibly could have been without Olympics again. It doesn't have to happen. So, these big things we should enjoy and take the opportunity to.
Yeah. We've beat it to death, or at least I have, but just the human spirit of these people to know what they had gone through. I mean, we weren't there, of course, but through years of education and such, we understand sort of what it was like for people in these camps, and for them to still have the drive and the ability and the want and the desire to still do such a thing, like under especially the first one, 1940, under such strict rules, and the punishments that could have came if they had caught them, and like none of them may have survived. So just being willing to risk literally everything. I mean, they almost everything was already taken from them, and they still wanted to do it. It's an amazing story of perseverance. Both of them are, and no matter how easy the one group had it over the other, if you want to think about it that way, it's still amazing human spirit and perseverance on the part of these individuals. And again, we got to talk about this more. Like these are two instances of competition, especially Olympic competition, that hopefully will never have to happen again. But in its time was quite an amazing feat, and I'm glad we found it. So hope you enjoyed it too. We're always looking for ideas. If you know something else like this and you want to shout us out, hit us up on social media. We'll add to the growing list of episode topics, and that's what you don't know about the Lost Olympics. Thanks for listening.
Bye. Thank you for listening to this episode of What You Don't Know About Sports. If you enjoyed what you heard today, please leave us a review, 5 stars only, and hit that subscribe button wherever you listen. If you have a great sports story, we want to hear about it. You can connect with us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at WYDKAS Podcast, and on our YouTube channel at What You Don't Know About Sports Podcast. All episodes are written, recorded, and edited by us. Stay tuned for the next episode. In my head, I was like, just ask if Serie A is there. And then I was like, he has no way of knowing that's what he's supposed to ask. There's 5 options for top
5 big 5 options.
Yeah. And there's no way for him to narrow it down past the fact that it wasn't England.